Hello QEP instructors. In this video, I will summarize the process writing principles we have discussed in our training. Just a reminder, the process writing part of your QEP course produces at least 5 pages, that's 1,250 words, of writing. To see marked improvement in your students' papers, you'll need to give them enough time to work through each of the process writing steps. This is how we can minimize many of the things we complain about in student writing. So here's one common complaint. Student papers are trite, boring, obvious, and plagiarized from other sources. Well, why? Because students don't know your subject matter well enough to have anything interesting to say about it. They need to think about and play with the concepts you're teaching. This is step 1 of process writing. Idea generation. Now, thinking and playing with ideas, these should sound familiar because the philosophy of idea generation is the same philosophy as writing to learn, writing that is short, spontaneous, exploratory, and so on. So from the beginning of the semester, you will carve out space for this intellectual play in the routine writing to learn activities you establish. As you approach the process writing assignment, you'll craft your writing to learn, free writing, graphic organizers, guided questions, whatever you've chosen, to nudge students toward first exploring and then deciding upon a question they want to answer in their process writing papers. Here's another complaint. Students type up any old thing the night before and turn it in as a final paper. That's where process writing steps 2, 3, and 4 come in. The idea here is to coax students into postponing the notion that they're finished long enough to do substantive revision, because revision, when writers truly re-see what they are writing, is where all of us see dramatic improvement. So in step 2, you assign a draft. You may not even call it a paper or a draft. It could be just one part of what will ultimately become the final paper, although it should not be an introduction or a conclusion yet, because at this point you want the writing to still feel exploratory and provisional, or in process. There's no need for students to have settled on a thesis statement at this early stage. They are still working their way toward what they want to say. As a side note, you'll notice that this is not how papers have been traditionally assigned. The old choose a topic, write a thesis statement, write an introduction, body, then conclusion. That way doesn't produce very good papers. In step 3, students get meaningful feedback on what they've written so far. The feedback they value most, of course, is yours, and for good reason. So let's say you read over draft 1 and limit yourself to the 1 and 2 suggestions that will most improve the draft at this point. You may also introduce another part of the assignment for students to include when they write draft 2. So now let's also say that you require students to work with the Writing Center consultant as they write draft 2. You will have given them 2 sources of feedback as they complete step 4, substantive revision. So now you have draft 2, and more likely than not, there is still plenty of room for improvement. Few of us perfect a piece of writing in just 2 stabs at it. So you cycle through steps 3 and 4 as many times as needed, or as many times as you have time for. You can give comments again, and you can also include another source of feedback, peer response, or maybe another trip to the Writing Center. After students have a draft with rich, organized, well-developed content, remember these are your higher order concerns. Then you go on to the second to last step, working on sentence level edits. This is one of the most difficult concepts for QEP instructors. It's hard to overlook grammatical errors in the earlier stages, especially because we think of all the red marks on our own school papers. But editing is a later order concern. Once students have corrected grammar, punctuation, and other stylistic problems, they move on to the last step, proofreading, which is checking for typographical errors. A good way to proofread is to cover the paper and read it line by line from the end back to the beginning. This makes us see what is really there instead of our minds filling in what we know ought to be there. Okay, so I've gone through this pretty quickly, but you have lots of resources to refer back to in your QEP textbooks. John Bean's Chapter 5, Dealing with Issues of Grammar and Correctness, begins on page 66. It will soothe your fears about not correcting grammar in every single draft. In particular, beginning on page 82 of that chapter, he talks about shifting from the old way of correcting papers that we know, the editing-oriented comments, to revision-oriented comments. Bean also discusses how to comment on student papers in Chapter 16, page 317. Chapter 4 in the Elements book is also about assigning and responding to revision. And Chapter 6 in Elements talks about teaching writing at the sentence level. On page 304, Bean explains the difference between higher order concerns and later order concerns. And in Chapter 15, Bean talks about coaching the writing process and handling the paper load. This is his chapter about process writing. All of Part 2 of the Content Area Writing book is about process writing. Remember, they call it public writing because that's what the final product of process writing is meant to be, a polished product ready to be read by the public. For those of you whose process writing paper is a research paper, look at Chapter 7 in Elements and Chapter 13 in Bean. Okay, so that's it for the principles of process writing. Next up, a video on designing your process writing assignment.